Order. The question is that the amendment be disagreed to, and I call the honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Let me start by agreeing with the member for Riverina. Everyone who can get vaccinated should get vaccinated. If you are eligible, get vaccinated. If you have concerns, speak to your GP. The problem for too many Australians is that for too long they haven't been eligible to get vaccinated and they haven't been able to access the vaccine. And it is because we have a Prime Minister that insisted that the vaccine rollout was not a race. It was a race. And now, as my community in Dunkley, communities across Victoria and New South Wales are living through yet another lockdown, we see the consequences of the fact that we are failing in that race. We were never in the front of the queue for the vaccine. No, Australia's rollout was ranked as the worst in the OECD as we approach the end of June of this year, 113th in the world. We still have one of the slowest rollouts in the developed world. It's great that it's gathering pace now, but why did it have to take this devastating Delta outbreak for the Prime Minister to finally approach the vaccine rollout as if it's a race? And now he wants Australians to believe him when he says it's not how you start the race, it's how you finish it. Well, what he fails to consider in that analogy between the start and the finish is everything that happens in the middle, is what happens during the race, the one that we are still in. And of course, what happens during the race is that the people who weren't vaccinated, who have been exposed and have caught COVID, have got sick. Some have tragically died. Businesses have collapsed. Families are struggling under the burdens of remote learning and losing jobs, and everyone seeming to be in the same house 24/7. What is also happening, and what I want to focus on in my brief remarks today, is that people's other health issues aren't being addressed in the way that they absolutely should be. And some of the decisions that are being made to try to deal with the Delta outbreak that we didn't need to deal with by lockdown had we actually been vaccinated are exacerbating people's inclination to let other health conditions go untreated during COVID. The Australian newspaper published today what they called a COVID-19 national poll, a YouGov poll. And what they published was that in response to the question, do you personally know anyone who has postponed or cancelled health checks, for example, mammograms, due to lockdown? 38% of respondents apparently answered yes. Almost 40% of people who were asked if they know anyone who has postponed or cancelled a health check because of lockdown said yes. In New South Wales and Victoria, perhaps not surprisingly, it was 43%. And apparently out of the respondents who were women, 43% said yes, and 46% of respondents who are parents of a child in school said yes. Now those figures, Deputy Speaker, no matter what the postponed or cancelled health check is, are disturbing. But I suspect, without knowing, that the pollsters put the example of mammograms in that question because we know that during the pandemic, women's instance of going and having mammograms, having their breasts checked for breast cancer has declined. And we know from the experience last year in Victoria that that can and it does have quite devastating and serious consequences for too many women and for the people that love them. Now, sometimes women haven't gone and had a mammogram during this pandemic because with all of the things that they've had to deal with, all of the extra burdens of family and loss of work and mental health and financial stress, they just haven't prioritised themselves. Sometimes they haven't gone and had their mammograms because they haven't been able to. And why? Why is this so important? Because for Australian women, breast cancer is the most common cancer, and it's the second most common cause of cancer-related death. Women trans and gender diverse people are urged to get routine screenings once they reach 40 because chances of breast cancer increase with age. 1 in 7 women will develop breast cancer in their lifetime, the statistics now tell us. The Radiation Therapy Advisory Group released a report recently that said there were 145,000 fewer mammograms in Australia in the first half of 2020 compared to the same period in 2018. 145,000. And most people in this chamber know that I speak from real and deep personal experience about how important mammograms are. You know, the director of the Breast Cancer Network of Australia, Vicky Durson, told ABC's RN Breakfast recently that 2,500 cancers were missed or delayed during last year due to screening disruptions and fears of leaving home. 2,500 cancers were missed. That is a profound number, because we know that the earlier you detect breast cancer, the better your 5-year and 10-year chances of living, basically, are. You know, there were missed and delayed diagnoses of over 300 breast cancer cases in Victoria last year alone. 300. And if we don't detect it early, it goes on to progress, and with later stage diagnosis, chances of 5 and 10-year success rates diminish. The total number of breast cancers diagnosed fell by 10% and early diagnosis by 38% last year in Victoria. And we can't see that as a figure that continues or that spreads across the country. And when you link that to the poll that was in the Australian today, it should be ringing alarm bells to governments and policy makers across the country. You know, breast cancers detected by a breast screening through Breast Screen, which is Australia's national breast screening program, have a 54% to 63% lower risk of causing death compared to breast cancer diagnosed in women who have never been screened. A screening mammogram can detect very small cancers, as small as a grain of rice, before symptoms are felt or even noticed by a woman or her doctor. You know, for women over 50, it is the best method for early detection of breast cancer. And yet we know that right now, as I give this speech, routine breast screening has been suspended in New South Wales as a consequence of this Delta outbreak. As a consequence of the lockdown and not enough vaccines getting into arms. You know, Breast Screen New South Wales said it's because of the increasing risk posed by the Delta strain, significant cancellations, and I quote, a need to redeploy staff to support the pandemic response. Whilst I understand the crisis that's facing New South Wales at the moment and all hands to the wheel to deal with the outbreak, this is a short-term measure which could have seriously negative long-term consequences. And I'm not alone in saying this, and I acknowledge state and federal Liberal and Labor members of Parliament who have all called on the New South Wales government to step in and change this situation. I looked at the New South Wales Breast Screen website today, and there's nothing to indicate that it's changed. And I urge the New South Wales government to do something about it. I also ask that the federal minister and the Prime Minister look at this. And if the New South Wales government need help to have extra staff so that breast screens can stay open, then do something about it. We've had a debate in this chamber today about some $13 billion worth of JobKeeper that was paid to businesses who actually increased their profits. Imagine what we could do with that $13 billion in the health system. We certainly don't need all of it to keep breast screens going, but some of it would be very, very welcome. This is not the time for anyone to neglect anything to do with their health. Get the vaccine. Do it for yourself and your family and the community. But don't put off your regular checks, your regular screening, and don't put off your treatment. Because at some time, we will get vaccines into enough arms, we will get out of this, and we don't want to then be dealing with another pandemic and another enormous burden on our health system, of all of those other illnesses, particularly cancers, which haven't been treated. Deputy Speaker, I'll finish just by quoting Professor Boyle, who's a medical oncologist at the University of Sydney, who also noted that women were presenting with larger breast cancers late last year after the suspension of national screening services, and that women didn't want to go to breast screens after it being closed and were scared, but then they have a higher rate of lymph node involvement needing chemotherapy treatment, and that if breast screens are shut down again for extended periods, her prediction is what we will find is that we will have another wave by Christmas time of people with delayed diagnosis. Don't delay your diagnosis. If your breast screen isn't open, go to your GP. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.